Perfect. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the fourth webinar of our 2021 Coastal Series. My name is Alyssa Barassa. I work for the Lake Huron Center for Coastal Conservation as a Coastal Stewardship Technician. We will be monitoring the chat box in the Q&A function, which should be visible at the bottom of your screen. Feel free to post any questions and we will try to answer as many as we can at the end of the webinar. This free webinar would not be possible without the generous funding from our incredible sponsors. Thank you. My colleague Erin, our Executive Director, will also be presenting with me this evening.
Hi, everyone. I'm Erin, and as Alyssa said, so I'm running this webinar from Goderich tonight, and we would like to first of all acknowledge that we are in the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe Nation, the people of the Three Fires known as Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi nations, and further give thanks to the Chippewas of Saugeen and the Chippewas of Nawash, now known as the Saugeen Ojibwe Nation, as the traditional keepers of this land. We would also like to recognize that shared rights exist near Goderich, where their territory overlaps with the territories of Aamjiwnaang First Nation, Walpole Island First Nation, and the Chippewas of Kettle and Stony Point First Nation. And we would encourage all of you to reflect on what lands you're listening from tonight.
So for those of you not familiar, the Lake Huron Center for Coastal Conservation was founded in 1998 with the goal of protecting and restoring Lake Huron's coastal environment. We are a non-government, non-profit charitable organization, and we have a small but mighty team of 4 staff. So let's get right into it by talking about native species. So native plants are species that are indigenous to a region or ecosystem as a result of natural processes with no human intervention. So it's important to remember that native species have adapted to their environment over thousands of years. They develop features like long root systems that help protect against things like shoreline erosion and flooding. So what is an invasive species? So invasive species can be a few different things, including non-native, aggressive spread, and dominant. So all of these terms fall under the umbrella term invasive species. So non-native plants are simply plants that have been introduced from another region. Invasive species are considered dominant if they displace or overtake native populations. Aggressive spread is when an invasive species overtakes an area to the point where the environment, economy, or human health becomes damaged. Aggressive spread, these terms are not mutually exclusive. They could be non-native species, but also aggressively spreading. Phragmites, for example, could fall under all of these categories depending on where you are on the shoreline. So here's just a little fun fact. The majority of all recorded extinctions that have occurred on islands include invasive species as one of the primary causes. So what is a species at risk? A species at risk is any native plant in danger of extinction or of disappearing. So the following terms are the different classifications from most at risk to least at risk, including extinct, extirpated, endangered, threatened, species of concern, and not at risk. So we're going to break down each one. So extinct means a species that is no longer exists anywhere on Earth. So for example, we have the big leaf skirk pea that has not been recorded since 1881. The collapse was likely due to the eradication of buffalo and flooding from dams. We also have extirpated, so that means it's a species that no longer exists in the wild in Canada, but still lives in other areas of the world. For example, we have the Illinois tick treefold. Its threats include grazing, mowing, and agriculture. We also have endangered, so that means it's a species that is facing imminent extirpation or extinction. For example, we have the horsetail spikerush, and their threats include invasive species since it's in competition with common reed, changing water levels, and deer grazing. We also have threatened species. So that means it's a species that is likely to become endangered if nothing is done to reverse the factors leading to its extirpation or extinction. So for example, we have the golden seal, and its threats include habitat loss and degradation. We also have species of concern. So that means it's a species that may become threatened or endangered because of a combination of biological characteristics or identified threats. So for example, we have the Riddle's goldenrod. Its threats include conversion of prairie habitat to farmland. So then we have species that are doing just fine. So we have not at risk species. So that means it's a species that is not at risk for extinction. A great example of this is marram grass or American beachgrass. So this is a common dune plant that we use when restoring eroded beaches due to its deep root system. So who determines which species are at risk? So there are two main bodies that make these decisions in Canada. We have the Committee of the Status of Endangered Wildlife in Canada, and they created the Species at Risk Act, also known as SARA. And then we have the Committee of the Status of Species at Risk in Ontario, and they created the Endangered Species Act, also known as ESA. So you might be wondering, how are they protected? Each of these distinctions have varying protective measures in place. So under the ESA, species that are classified as endangered or threatened automatically receive legal protection as well as habitat protection. And under SARA, it is an offense to kill, harm, harass, capture, possess, collect, buy, or sell species at risk. And is also an offense to damage their habitat, for example, a den or nest. So if you see someone harming a species at risk, you can contact the Natural Heritage Information Center, or you can call the tip line at MNRF. Now let's talk about some plants, Erin.
Thanks so much, Alyssa. So as Alyssa mentioned, native plants are those that are considered to be indigenous to an area, meaning that they originated in that area, they naturally occurred there, and they've evolved and adapted to the local conditions, including the extreme elements that are found along the Great Lakes shoreline, like the high winds, the waves, the extreme temperature fluctuations, and of course, lake effect precipitation. On the Great Lakes, especially during times of high water levels like we've been experiencing, it's critical to keep vegetation along bluffs and on beaches, since this vegetation provides a buffer between your home and the lake. While planting native vegetation can't necessarily stop erosion from happening, it might help to slow the process down a bit by absorbing excess water and binding the soil with deep root systems. If you'd like more information about how beach dune ecosystems and bluff ecosystems function and the relationship with vegetation, if you want to learn more about that, you can visit our website and check out some of our other webinars. Plants that are within around 3 meters of the shoreline of a lake, stream, or even a ditch can help to absorb excess water, sediment, use up some of the nutrients and contaminants that are in the water. This is called a vegetated buffer. And even uncut grass can act as a natural water filter. Unfortunately, our planet is facing a biodiversity crisis. But native plants help to provide valuable habitat and food sources for birds, butterflies, and other wildlife. So you might be thinking that you live in town or miles away from the lake, and you might be wondering if what you do on your property really affects the lake. Well, the answer is yes. And this map shows why. If you look, you can see that each color on the map is a different drainage basin for all of the Great Lakes. So that means that all of the water that falls onto the orange and brown area will eventually end up in Lake Huron. So this hopefully makes it easier to visualize that you can have an impact on the water, even if you don't live right near Lake Huron, which might be the case for a lot of you out there this evening. Or maybe you're joining us from the drainage basin of one of our other Great Lakes, like Lake Ontario or Lake Erie. Now that we know why this matters, we can start talking about the plants, and I'm going to be talking about them using their common names mainly, but it's important to know that there can be many different common names for the same plant, and that makes it very confusing sometimes. So we've also listed their scientific names on our slides to try to make it easier for you if you're trying to find a particular plant. And sometimes these scientific names are really fun to say. And sometimes I have absolutely no idea how to say them either. But basically, the first word in the scientific name is the genus. Like Acer means maple, and Betula means birch. And the second word in the scientific name tells you what species you're talking about. So like a sugar maple or a yellow birch. In some cases, I've just written SPP after the genus. And that means that I'm talking about many different species within the genus. So I'm not narrowing things down to one specific species. Since this is a coastal plant boot camp, we're going to talk about a lot of plants in a very short amount of time, but our goal is not to show you every single coastal plant that you might come across. We want to show you some of the common ones and give you some ideas for projects that you could start on your own property. And almost anyone can help the environment by planting a native plant garden. Even if you live in an apartment or a condo, you can still make a difference. You could start by planting a mini native plant garden on your balcony. You could install a green wall in your condo. These green walls have become very trendy in the past few years. They're being installed in office buildings, universities, and even apartments. And many cities are installing green roofs on government buildings, on office buildings, condos, and even bus stops, like in this photo here, which is kind of cool. And I've heard that a lot of places are actually making this mandatory for new builds. And in this photo on the left, this is actually a green roof in London, England, and a rare orchid that was thought to be extinct in the UK was discovered growing on this office building roof in London. And these green roofs, they become a regular sight in the city, and they've become a really important place for wildlife. Now, if you have a little bit more space on your property to work with, you'll be able to do a lot more, of course, whether your place is in the middle of the city or whether it's on the shoreline. What you're planting is still going to make a difference to our Great Lakes. And the most grown crop, unfortunately, in North America is something that no one's eating, no one's really asking for, and no one's really quite sure what to do with. Trimmed grass lawns first emerged in 17th century England at the homes of large, wealthy landowners. This was a status symbol. And unfortunately, habitat loss and fragmentation causes the loss of species and worsens the effects of climate change. So we need to create habitat in places where we've been green paving it with lawns and with non-native species. When we're filling our urban areas with introduced plants, we're severing those crucial relationships between native plants and wildlife that have evolved over millennia. And maintaining a pristine yard actually contributes to climate change. It could end up producing the equivalent amount of greenhouse gas emissions as a transcontinental flight every year. So by mowing your lawn less, you are helping wildlife and you're fighting climate change, which I think is a great excuse to tell your neighbors. And just quickly take a look at the difference in root lengths between the turf grass on the left and the beach grass on the right. So obviously, the American beach grass is going to hold sand and soil in place a lot better. And turf grass close to water bodies actually attracts geese as well, which then you end up having a lot more waste on the beach, and that can contribute to increased E. coli levels. And native plants as well require less water, less fertilizer, and less pesticides because they're adapted to our environment. If you are going to fertilize your lawn, please try to fertilize responsibly. We don't want to be applying too much fertilizer. That's a waste of effort, waste of money, and it's damaging lake and river ecosystems. So if you absolutely must have a lawn on your shoreline property and you feel like fertilizing is necessary, Just try to minimize the amount you're using and be accurate with the application, remembering that excess nutrients like phosphorus entering water bodies through runoff can contribute to harmful algae blooms, like we've been seeing in Lake Erie in the past few decades. Many people are actually choosing to replace their lawns altogether. They're removing them and planting native species, which I think can look really nice if it's planned out well and if it's maintained regularly. So I decided to try this on my own property. And so I've got an ecosystem experiment going, and I started by checking out local nurseries. And I was surprised to find out how many have a large selection of native plants compared to looking just a few years ago. I started off by planting a few trees and roping off some areas to stop mowing, and I wanted to see what might start growing on its own there. Now, this is obviously a big project, so I decided to split it up into sections over a few years. So in this area under the tree, I used a cultivator to remove the grass, and I've planted shade-tolerant native plants. And in this area, I started planting some sun-loving plants. And this garden is actually filling in so nicely, even though I only put it in a couple of months ago. So I'm really excited to see how it turns out over the next few years as I continue to expand it. I've already noticed so many butterflies and other pollinators using my garden, and I was really excited to find this American painted lady caterpillar on one of my plants. And that plant is the Pearly Everlasting. It's a sun-loving plant. It can grow up to 3 feet tall, and it's a perennial in the sunflower family. And it's pretty commonly found on beaches, so you might see it in the wild, and it's doing quite well in my yard in town. And speaking of caterpillars, here's a photo of a monarch butterfly caterpillar that we found enjoying some milkweed at one of our restoration sites. Monarchs can't survive without milkweed since their caterpillars only eat the milkweed plants and the adults lay their eggs on them. Last year, our amazing Coastal Conservation Youth Corps was out planting milkweed seeds at the Goderich main beach, and we were really excited to see how many milkweed plants grew over the spring, and we saw monarchs using it this summer. And this plant loves sunshine. It can be found on meadows and on shorelines. And the second favorite of the monarch is swamp milkweed. And I planted this on my property this spring, and it's just starting to flower. It does best in wet soils, but it seems to be doing pretty well on my property in town. And butterfly weed is another member of the milkweed family, but it doesn't have the same milky sap. It does have beautiful orange flowers, which attract butterflies and honeybees and hummingbirds. And this one actually feeds the caterpillars of 3 different butterfly species, which is kind of neat. And this is another little friend that I have found using my native garden. He seems to be enjoying all of the nice snacks in the yard. That's an eastern cottontail rabbit. And I'm just going to talk a little bit about some of the plants that I installed in the sunny areas of my garden. And most of these are pretty versatile plants that could be planted in town, or if you have a cottage property as well. And the first is called bee balm. It's a native perennial in the mint family, and it has a nice sweet aroma, and it's probably my favorite in the garden right now. I planted the hot pink ones on the right, and I came across these light purple ones on a hike the other day. Not sure what the butterfly is, but maybe someone out there tonight knows what it is, and you can let us know in the chat box. I also planted some coneflowers, also known as echinacea, and they're tough little native flowers that bring in butterflies and bees and birds to your garden. And there are so many different varieties of this plant, so many colors you can choose from. And this is the echinacea that people use sometimes to treat cold and flu symptoms. So if you are planning out your next garden, especially be sure to avoid any invasive species, and keep in mind that a lot of invasive species are still sold at garden centers. So ask for what you want. Let these garden centers know that you want to see more native plants and that you're not interested in planting invasive species in your yard. One example of this is a type of ornamental grass called miscanthus, and there are around 20 different species of miscanthus and many different cultivars with appealing names like Huron sunrise. That sounds great. Sounds like something you'd want to plant on your shoreline. There's a lot of marketing out there for this species, but don't buy into the hype. This plant is in danger of becoming one of the worst invasive plants in Canada. And unfortunately, I was at a garden center this year and they had an entire row of miscanthus varieties for sale that I was disappointed to see. But if you're looking for something else nice to plant as an ornamental grass, little bluestem is a great choice. It forms dense little mounds that are around 18 to 24 inches in height. And it has a beautiful purpley blue color that you can see in the photo, hopefully. And it turns a reddish mahogany color in the fall, which I'm looking forward to seeing. Or big bluestem is another great option for backyards or shorelines if you're looking for something a little bit taller, if you want to create some privacy on your property. It's also called turkey foot sometimes because of the way the seed head branches out into those 3 parts there. It kind of looks like a turkey's foot. And yeah, it's a taller species, 4 to 8 feet in height, and it's often found in tallgrass prairies because it's a drought tolerant species, but it can also tolerate periodic flooding and high water tables. Bottlebrush is another ornamental native grass that's doing really well in my garden. It grows around 3 to 5 feet tall, and it's really adaptable. It can adapt to a lot of different soils, including heavy clay, and it does well in full sun and partial shade. So I planted this one a little bit closer to the shade of my maple tree than the other grasses. And asters, there are so many different asters. There are 11 common species in Ontario. There's also a whole bunch more less common and rare species, and there's hybrids, and they can be quite challenging to learn to identify. So we won't have time to get into that tonight. But I planted the purple New England aster in the photo on the right, and it's doing really well. And the ones in the photos on the left are ones that actually just started growing by themselves in the areas where I stopped mowing the lawn. They're a really pretty wildflower. It does well in part shade to full sun, and they can grow up to 4 feet tall. A rain garden is something else that's great you can install on your property. It's a planted depression in the yard that helps to absorb water from any hard surfaces. And they help to reduce the amount of water that's flowing over the land into storm drains and across beaches. And they provide habitat for wildlife like butterflies, dragonflies, frogs, songbirds. If you live on the shoreline, you might be used to seeing stormwater channels like these, like maybe the one on the left, but vegetated swales, sometimes called bioswales, they're stormwater channels that are planted with native grasses and shrubs, and they help to slow down stormwater discharge, reduce sediment, and promote water filtration before that runoff is entering our lake. And these swales seem to be working very well in helping to manage stormwater in beach areas, and many municipalities have started installing them. So if you're looking for some plants for a rain garden or bioswale, please do not purchase yellow iris. This was introduced as an ornamental plant for ponds and water gardens, but it's spread really quickly into nature. It's poisonous for humans and animals. It's reducing habitat for native fish and birds, and it's still sold in nurseries. But if you do see this out, maybe in front of your cottage, you can control this plant by cutting its stems and leaves below the water line before the plant blooms for the season and has the opportunity to go to seed. Try not to disturb the soil more than necessary because the plant actually likes that and will grow even bigger. If you want something instead, though, blue flag iris is a great option for shorelines. The blooms have nectar and pollen for hummingbirds and bumblebees, and the blue flag also is a source of shelter for animals living along the shoreline. It grows around 2 to 3 feet and flowers from May to July. And I read that the rhizomes are highly toxic. However, Indigenous peoples have traditionally used this plant to alleviate a wide variety of ailments. And the leaves were also used for basket weaving and mats, apparently. Now, this is one of my favorites to see in the forest in the spring, but it's also great for a bioswale or a rain garden. Wild columbine does well in shade to full sun, and it provides nectar in the early spring to hummingbirds and butterflies and bees. And it's also deer and rabbit resistant, so it's great for a yard. And I've seen this available in many nurseries. Vervain, also known as verbena, grows around 2 to 3 feet tall, and it's another great option for a bioswale or a rain garden. It also does really well in fields and open areas, and it likes sunshine. I haven't tried this one yet, but hoping to add it next year. And another bonus is apparently it keeps vampires at bay. Back in ancient Rome, apparently, vervain was used in religious ceremonies to purify the space and altars. And it's also said that soldiers kept the flowers on them for protection and to outwit their enemies. Pagans apparently used it for love potions and protection spells. And vervain was hung, it was worn as an amulet or carried to ward off evil spirits. And most recently, it was used as a tool to avoid mind control attempts and to injure vampires in the TV show, The Vampire Diaries. Probably one of the most popular plants that's native to grow in North America is the black-eyed Susan. It's a really pretty flower that blooms later into the summer and into the fall and tends to attract butterflies. They're really easy to grow, they're drought tolerant, and they have a really large root system that can reach about 6 feet. So that root system is great for stabilizing soil, so it's a good option for shorelines. Something we don't want to see on shorelines is Himalayan balsam. This is an invasive species, especially on riverbanks. I spotted it recently along the Maitland River where it's growing probably like 10 feet tall. And it's not dangerous to humans or animals, but it does cause some ecological harm since it grows in such tight stands that suppress native grass and other flora. And when it dies off in the fall, it leaves the riverbanks bare and more susceptible to erosion. And my last recommendation for a shoreline buffer or a rain garden is spotted Joe pieweed. It's often found in sandy wetlands and it feeds several species of butterfly. It's another really pretty plant. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about some shady ideas now for plants and hopefully inspire you to plant a few trees on your property. A really popular one, of course, is the iconic maple tree. And we really like to see sugar maples, red maples, and silver maples because those are all native to Ontario. Often a popular one for properties for ornamental purposes is the Norway maple. And you'll see in these photos, there's a cultivar called the Crimson King that has these red leaves. So sometimes it's called a red maple by people, which is confusing. And it's not the same thing as our native red maple. So if you're going to choose a species for your yard, try to choose one of the three on the right. And then we'll move on to the poplars, which are also called aspens sometimes. And there are three pretty common ones that we see along the Lake Huron shoreline. There's the balsam poplar, the trembling aspen, and the large tooth aspen. Those are all great. What we don't like to see on the coast is white or silver poplar or the black or Lombardy poplar. They tend to grow in very dense clumps that tend to crowd out other native species. So we don't want to see those on the shore. And if you do have those, if you have a large one, you can remove the bark around the base of the trunk. And if it's a smaller one, you could remove it with shears or a chainsaw as well. White birch is a fast-growing and short-lived species. It likes sunshine, so it tends to be found in young forests and on the edges of shorelines. They make really nice shade trees. However, someone will have to deal with removing them after anywhere from 30 to 60 years. So they are a good option for your property though. And then onto the pines. If you want to identify what type of pine you're looking at, first thing to do is count the number of needles in each little clump. If it's 5 needles in a little bunch, then that's pretty easy. You probably have a white pine on your hands. And I like to remember that by thinking that the word white has 5 letters, and this tree has needles in groups of 5. The needles on this are also really soft, and it's a beautiful tree. If you only have 2 needles in each cluster, then you're probably looking at a red pine or possibly an Austrian pine that was planted for ornamental purposes. And so those are pretty long needles, but if you have groups of 2 shorter needles, you might be looking at a Scots pine or a jack pine. And jack pines are usually found in northern Ontario and on the United States shores of Lake Huron, not so much on the southeastern shores. The way to tell the difference though is that the Scots pine needles, they tend to kind of stick together and they're a little bit twisted. But if you look at jack pines, the 2 needles tend to spread out into a V, or I like to think of it as like a jackrabbit's ears. Scots pines should be removed if you find them on your property. You can again remove the bark around the base of the tree trunk to stress it, or take it down with shears or a chainsaw. Good time to do this is November because they actually make lovely Christmas decorations. I've made wreaths out of Scots pine before. For spruces, there are only 3 spruces native to Ontario. They're black, white, and red. Blue spruce have been introduced as an ornamental species, but they're not native here, and neither are Norway spruce. They're both ornamentals. Since these trees aren't native, their presence can damage our natural ecosystems. So we encourage you to choose native spruces like the white spruce for your property. So you'll be helping the environment in that case. And native spruces are much less susceptible to disease. So a white spruce would be a better financial investment as well. And we have tamaracks here, and this is probably one of my favorites. It's also called an eastern larch or a black larch or a whole bunch of other different common names. The needles kind of go in this circular whorls, they're called, and they're green in the summer. They turn this beautiful yellow color in the fall, and then they fall off. So that actually makes them pretty unique. It makes them a deciduous conifer, and they are often found along the shoreline of Lake Huron. Another common site is the eastern white cedar. It's used pretty often for hedges, but the Bruce Peninsula is actually home to really ancient cedars. They might look really small, but that's because of the harsh environment that they're growing in. You can actually find Ontario's oldest tree on the Bruce Peninsula in Lion's Head. And it first started growing in the year 688 AD. So that makes that cedar 1,333 years old, which is just incredible. Common juniper is a widespread conifer in the cypress family, and it makes another great ornamental shrub. It likes dry, sandy soil, and it likes lots of sun. And its berries are used for gin, which is kind of neat. If you're wondering what you can plant in the shady areas under these trees, I have a few ideas for you. The sensitive fern is one that I've planted, and its name comes from the sensitivity of the fern to early frost. And ferns reproduce by spores, which is kind of neat. And this one will grow about 1 to 3 feet in height. Now, if we're looking at ground covers, there are several invasive ground covers that we really don't want to see on properties. So English ivy, periwinkle, and goutweed. We see them a lot on coastal shoreline properties and people's gardens in the forests, and they're really harmful to forest ecosystems. So we recommend removing them on your property wherever possible. And this can be done by digging up the root system with a spade and cutting the stems with a trimmer. It's quite a bit of work, but it's really worth it in the end. And some things you can plant instead would be bearberry. This is a great ground cover species. I've got it planted under my tree, and it has dark red berries that are food, a winter food source for small mammals. And it grows anywhere that's shady, that you don't want a lawn maybe, and it does pretty well in rocky areas and can help to slow erosion on slopes as well. Here's another easy to grow ground cover for a shaded woodland garden or along a stream or a pond. This is false Solomon seal, and it has really pretty white tiny flowers that come in the late spring. And it also has berries that feed birds and small mammals. If you're looking for something for a ground cover for a sunnier area, wild strawberry is an option. It grows about 6 inches tall, and it seems to like my lawn. One plant that we really don't like is garlic mustard. This is a biennial herb in the mustard family, and biennial means that the plant takes 2 years to complete its full biological life cycle. It tends to thrive in shady forests or along stream banks, but we've seen it along the Lake Huron shoreline too. It tends to take over the forest understory, and it kills off all of the good native plants like the wood poppy, and it's actually toxic to butterflies, but it's edible to humans. There are actually a lot of recipes out there, so you can make garlic mustard pesto, or you can use the smaller leaves in salads. But make sure you're not taking plants from private property without permission, and make sure that there haven't been any herbicides or anything sprayed on them if you intend to eat them, of course. And I mentioned that garlic mustard is harmful to the wood poppy. It's a perennial herb that's just over 1 foot tall, and it's actually a species at risk. It's an endangered species in Ontario, meaning it's facing extinction in the wild. And I've planted this under my tree, and it's got really pretty yellow flowers with 4 petals, and it blooms pretty much all summer, and it can be found in woodlands, forests, and yeah, it seems to be pretty happy in my yard. Something else you could plant in a shady area for ground cover is Canada anemone. I always have trouble saying that one. It grows around the same height, 1 or 2 feet, and has a pretty little white flower in the spring. And it is a really adaptable plant, but it can become a little bit aggressive if conditions are favorable. So keep that in mind. And if you're looking for something taller, there is the cardinal flower, and it can grow up to 6 feet tall, and has these beautiful red flowers on it and terminal spikes. And it depends on hummingbirds for pollination. Its common name alludes to the bright red robes that are worn by Roman Catholic cardinals. That's how it got its name. And it's perfect for the edge of a woodland garden, which is where I've planted it. And we also have the blue counterpart, which is the great blue lobelia. It blooms in late summer with these beautiful purpley blue flowers. This species scientific name is syphilitica, if I'm saying it right. It's kind of an unfortunate name based on the fact that it was a supposed cure for syphilis. A common plant that I see on my hikes through coastal forests is the mayapple, which blooms in May and grows around 1 foot, 1.5 feet tall. And it has 2 leaves and 1 flower, and the flower grows underneath the leaves, kind of hanging like it's under an umbrella. And another one that I often see is wild ginger that I've planted in my yard too. It seems to be doing really well in my shady garden, and it's another great option for a low growing ground cover that will help keep its foliage throughout the season. It's also been traditionally used as a seasoning and to treat colds and fevers, apparently. Foxglove beard tongue is a really interesting name. I'm not really sure where that name came from, but it's kind of funny. This is a taller flower. It grows around 4 feet tall, and it's a really adaptable plant. It can tolerate shade to full sun and many different soil types. It's cold and drought tolerant, and it has these pretty small white flowers that attract pollinators. I planted this under my maple tree, but it hasn't flowered yet, so I'm waiting to see what happens next summer. And I'm just going to talk about a few plants that we commonly see in coastal sand dunes. And one of the most interesting ones is the pitcher's thistle. This is a threatened species, so another species at risk, and the global population of the pitcher's thistle is limited to the Great Lakes Basin. So in Canada, the pitcher's thistle is only found in Ontario, and it's only found on maybe around 30 different sites. It's pretty different from most of the more common thistles that you might see in fields or on the roadside. It's got really slender leaves that are covered in a white fine fuzz. It loves wind-blown sandy habitats. It really likes coastal sand dune ridges, and it grows amongst other dune plants. And it might take a few years of growing before it starts to flower. Unfortunately, this has become a species at risk because it faces quite a few threats, including recreational use, so vehicles on the dunes, manipulation of the dune environment through shoreline development, landscaping, and habitat loss has had a big impact on this species. American beachgrass, if you've been to any of our other coastal center events, you've probably heard us go on and on about this plant. It's one of our favorites. This is a pioneer species on sand dunes. So if you're looking to do a sand dune restoration project, this is really the place to start. It's a fantastic grass for dune restoration. Another plant that we often see on sand dunes is evening primrose. Like the name says, the flowers open at night and close again in the morning, and the pollination is done by nocturnal pollinators like moths. It can be a little bit aggressive, so keep that in mind if you're thinking of planting it on your property. Canada wild rye is another great option. We see sometimes on our beaches, but it would be a great ornamental plant in a garden or on your shoreline property. One we don't like to see is Phragmites, of course, and I'm sure a lot of you out there know quite a bit about this plant, but it's a terrible invasive species, and if you'd like to learn more about it, we have a lot of information about it on our website, including information about how to remove it. Another one that we don't like to see on shorelines is spotted knapweed. There are actually 5 different invasive knapweed species in Ontario, and this is one of them. It's a really competitive weed. It invades disturbed areas of the shore, and it degrades the native plant communities, so it kills off all of the good plants, and it's kind of a pain to remove, but you can dig up the root system with a spade and cut the stems with trimmers, but make sure you're wearing gloves when you do that because it can be irritating to your skin. And this one also is, it takes quite a while to remove. It might take about 3 years to stop it from coming back. And if you're on the lookout for invasive species in your sand dune, sweet white clover is one to keep an eye out for. It causes a lot of the same problems as the other invasive species, and you can remove it in a very similar manner by hand pulling. And we recommend for sweet white clover to do the removal either early in the spring or late in the fall. And it's a lot easier to do after it's rained. Colt's foot is a perennial invasive weed that's come from Europe. And it's found on farms and on shorelines. I've seen it on beaches quite a bit. And again, best thing to do is hand pull it when the soil is damp. Dense blazing star is a beautiful flower that we see sometimes in sand dunes. It's a threatened species, so another species at risk, and it grows quite tall. It can grow about 6 feet high. and it's only found on the in southwestern Ontario, so it'll be found on the southeastern shores of Lake Huron. It's facing threats like habitat loss due to invasive species, urban development, or habitat alteration. Horsetail is a genus of vascular plants that reproduce by spores rather than seeds. And we see it on beaches a lot, and people ask us about it. And it's considered a weed in agricultural areas. Despite its name, it's actually poisonous to horses. But these plants are loaded with silica. So apparently the Romans used to use them to scour pots and pans and to polish metal. And it's used nowadays in shampoos, and it's mostly found in damp areas. And this is actually one of the toughest plants on the planet. It's survived pretty much unchanged since prehistoric times. It can be pretty aggressive, so I wouldn't recommend planting it in a garden, but if you do see it on a beach, we would recommend just leaving it there. Wormwood is a perennial herb that has been used in traditional medicines, and it's another biennial plant, meaning it takes 2 years to complete its full life cycle. So the photo on the left is its first year form, and the photo on the right is it in its second year form. Invasive species for ground covers are, again, pretty common, and crown vetch is one that we see a lot. It's in the pea or legume family, and it's often been used as a road bank stabilizer. So sometimes people are tempted to use this on their coastal bluffs. But since this is an invasive species that threatens natural areas, we encourage other native options. If you do see this growing on your property and you want to remove it, you can dig up the root system, but keep in mind that seeds can stay dormant in the soil for over 15 years and still be viable. Silverweed is another common beach plant that we see, and this could be used instead of the crown vetch. It's part of the rose family, and it likes shady, moist soils. And it sends out runners from the parent plant in multiple directions, building a pretty complex root system. So this would be a better ground cover to use in some areas. Another beach species that we see quite often is the sand cherry, which is also called the dwarf sand plum in some places. And it's another plant from the rose family. It loves dry, sunny, sandy environments, and it attracts birds. We've seen this on quite a few areas of the shoreline, along with quite a few different species of willow. I don't have time to get into all the different species tonight, unfortunately, but one that we see quite a bit is called heartleaf willow or sand dune willow, and it really likes those sandy beach areas. People are often tempted to remove willows from beaches, but we encourage them not to, because they're a great defense for your property during times of high water levels and can act as a bit of a buffer in storm events. We also see Indian paintbrush is another really pretty wildflower. Something kind of neat about it is that it's a partial parasite to other plants. So its roots actually establish connections with roots of other species, and it uses some of the nutrients from the other plant. And it tends to like to have its feet wet. So we see it in coastal meadow marshes. And the last plant I wanted to mention is the lakeside daisy. This is another species at risk. It's a threatened species. It's not found on beaches, but it's found on alvars, which are areas of exposed bedrock with very little soil. You might be lucky to spot one of these on the Bruce Peninsula or on Manitoulin Island. And it's a small perennial plant in the aster family that reaches just over a foot in height. It faces some threats as well, including habitat destruction due to limestone quarrying and development in rural areas. It's also usually found in places that are popular for hiking and recreation, so sometimes it can be trampled and damaged. And Alyssa's going to talk a little bit about more large-scale restoration work, like on a farm.
Yes, so how do you rewild on the large scale? So I grew up on my family's farm outside of Goderich, and I always wondered how we could utilize our space to protect the local environment. But with such a large area, it's kind of difficult to know where to begin. So most of the photos you'll see in this section are real life examples from our family farm. So the first thing you can do is crop rotation. So crop rotation has many benefits, including replenishment of soil nutrients. For example, corn needs phosphorus and potassium to grow. So if you're always planting corn in the same fields, it will become deplenished over time. It also slows down soil erosion, and crop rotation is widely used today. We have learned from our past mistakes. Poor agricultural practices was one of the main causes of the 1930s Dust Bowl, for example. Another thing you can do is plant early successional forests that consists of shrubs and young trees. That now this ecosystem is relatively rare in Ontario. This is because most of Southern Ontario properties are privately owned, therefore it is managed by the landowner. So to increase habitat diversity on your property, you can plant shrubs and tree seedlings in these open areas. So some native trees and shrubs you can plant include American beech, Canadian hemlock, balsam fir, dogwood, red mulberry, and animals that will come back to this type of habitat include warbler species, ruffed grouse, and eastern cottontail. So my neighbor actually has created a successional forest on his property. So I'll be curious to see what kind of wildlife comes to our farm in years to come. So if you can, leave a space for grassland. Some management is needed to maintain grassland habitat. If left untouched, grass is likely to turn into forest over time. Wildlife that is likely to return to grass habitats include butterflies, moths, eastern kingbird, grasshopper sparrow, red fox, and the savanna sparrow. And sometimes the best thing you can do is just leave it be. Nature will do its thing if you give it the opportunity. So for example, we found that herrings love nesting in our bush on our farm. We actually counted 15 nests, and they like to feed on fish from our ponds. So you might be wondering, what can you do about all of this? Well, there's plenty of ways to help. You can reduce invasive species on your property. You can share knowledge, question development plans that could destroy habitats, improve your species identification skills since you can't protect what you don't know about. So there's also other ways to get involved. There are tons of community groups if you would like to get involved further. There are some specific to Phragmites. That includes Lambton Shores Phragmites Group, Kincardine Residents Against Phragmites, and Ipperwash Frag Fighters. There's also more general groups like the Brucedale Residents Association. At the Coastal Center, if you have a lakefront property in Township of Huron-Kinloss, Municipality of Kincardine, or Town of Saugeen Shores, you can sign up for our Green Ribbon Champion program. We provide free beach assessments and restoration work. You could also sign up to be a Coast Watcher. This is our citizen science program that collects data on Lake Huron, including species at risk information. So you can join us on August 10th from 7 to 8 p.m. Erin will be talking about shorebirds. So we couldn't possibly cover all of Lake Huron's coastal plants today, but if you would like to learn more, you can check out our coastal plant guide or our Bluff Native Species Guide on our website, along with these other great resources. Once again, we want to show our appreciation for the generous funding from our sponsors. These free events would not be possible without the support of these organizations and individuals like yourselves. If you would like to make a donation to one of our charitable programs, please visit our website at www.lakehuron.ca/donate, or feel free to give us a call. Thank you everyone for listening. I think we might have about 5 minutes for questions. So please feel free to put it in the Q&A function at the bottom or the chat box, and Erin and I will do the best to answer them.
Thanks, Alyssa. Thanks so much, everyone, for listening. I think I've stopped sharing my screen now, so I'm going to check out the chat box and see if any questions have come in. Nothing yet, but we can give a few minutes. I know it takes some time to type things out sometimes, but
we can also stop recording now if you'd like, Erin.